to be vilified universally without question, and there's no discussion to be had here. And yet, someone who chooses, in other words, what that gender identity is something that is malleable and open to options, and actually infinite options. Why? And I think
Well,
there is a
maybe he's
contradiction
vilified
there.
because he asked a question that's at the heart of the problem with identity
Well,
politics.
quite.
Period. It's
I mean, particularly because when it comes to race, I mean, virtually all intersectionists would accept that race is socially constructed. This is something they're always talking about. And so, therefore, in a sense, there is more of a case for transracialism. If you want to say that that it is an identity that can be mixed.
well, in some sense, we already accept transracialism as a given. And so here's something I might as well get in trouble for this. Well, if your ancestry is 95% Caucasian and 5% non-Caucasian, Asian, black, let's say, you're not Caucasian.
Right.
Generally speaking, you can identify with the minority group. And so at some point, the question becomes, well, it's a ridiculous question, which is why the whole notion of group identity construed in this way is so pathological. But we obviously accept some degree of transracial identification if your racial group is disproportionately in one category, but you identify with the other, and that's instantly not only accepted, it's standard practice.
Right. And I'm with the intersectionists on this insofar as race, we're all the same. Ever since we've broken down the human genome, we know there are no differences between us. So this idea that it must be so rigidly policed, this social construct, these arbitrary ideas, and yet I think it's something.
Okay, so now we know why. Now we know exactly why Dawkins got himself in so much trouble.
Okay, and
he put his finger. Well, for sure, it's for sure. But the magical super Nazis are always in trouble. So
you are exactly. Exactly. But then what? But with the question of the gender identity debate, but this is the debate we need to be having. Is actually the other thing he put his finger on there, is that actually people are arguing with different definitions in their heads. For the identitarians, the idea of a woman is an identity. It isn't a biological reality. But for most people, the classification of woman is biological reality, not identity. So in other words, and why is it that we cannot have that discussion? So, okay, so you believe this thing, and we believe the other, and that's why we're at loggerheads. But let's have the discussion. Why can that not happen? Why does it have to be? If you've decided.
Well, that's actually what we're trying to unpack, is what's the motivation at the root of this. And it seems to me, I do believe it's something like a pronounced infantilism. I mean, one of the things I've been toying with is the idea that the demand for gender fluidity in late adolescence, let's say, is something like the consequence of insufficient fantasy play in childhood. That I remember, for example, when my son was little, his sister and her friends used to dress him up as a fairy princess. Mm-hmm. They did this with some regularity, and I kind of cast a dim eye on that, but I thought it through, and it sort of disturbed me, and then I thought it through, and I thought, wait a second here, leave the kid alone, leave the girls alone. He is playing out what it means to be female in dramatic play, and he needs to do that because otherwise he can't understand what it means to be female. That's how children understand. That's how adults understand things. For God's sake, we go to a movie and we watch.
Okay, Jordan, if you can see that and you can understand that, then why can't you understand that that's what our founding fathers were doing when they were wearing the women's wigs? They were taking on the roles of femininity and not letting women play the more feminine one of the two species, of our species, I should say. So we did the same thing. We did it all along. I was saying in other videos about the television shows, the movies. They've always done this. We've had transgenderism all along. It was hidden in plain sight. It was rubbed in our face, and everyone chose not to see things for what they were. We've had presidents' wives that were transgenders over the years. Not the ones you think that I'm going to say, but other ones that were transgender. Big deal. Who cares? But that's what they were doing. They were playing. Men were playing both roles. Women on a human scale. Nothing to do with the false creator or the creator or the true creator. Nothing to do with them, because the false creator and the creator divided, and divided male and female, which is one of the reasons why we fit each other by the race and by the nationality. That tells us when we were divided, in what order, I should say, they divided us. And when humans took over and had added the human influence to it all, stealing the creator, the false creator's work, and applying their knowledge, which we all had at one time. We all had the knowledge. We all were in touch with this energy, and they gave us this cheap bio version, synthetic now version of a reality, and it's just gone too fucking far. And it was supposed to go too far. We were told it was going to go too far. We were told why it was going to go too far, to divide us. And they're going to keep dividing and dividing and dividing. The only question is this the end of the division? Are they now, or should I say finally, I almost said finally, are they finally going to now blow the final trumpet? Is that what they're ready to do? Because they write the history, because they wrote the Bibles, they wrote the every one of them, every religious script, they're all written by the same, all the way down to the recent literature of your new religions of science, were all written by the same entities, the same souls, the same spirits, the same energies. And
contradiction doesn't just go away because you want to allow the conversation to happen.
The contradiction gets played out in actuality if you don't allow it to be dealt with in abstraction.
So then the question is, how do we break through? And I mean, this is something I've been really, really thinking about. Is that it's no longer just a matter of trying to persuade people. It's almost trying to de-radicalize people at this point. How do I explain to someone the world isn't this fantasy world that you've created in your head, where it's full of transphobes and neo-Nazis and all these and good versus evil. The world is actually much more complex and nuanced. It requires discussion and thought.
show it to them. Show it to them, just like I'm doing for
So
you.
we can
Show
have
it to
that
them,
discussion.
Well, it used to be that you sent them to
so they can see it for themselves.
Study the humanities.
That's the last thing you should do now.
Well, that was the answer. I mean, that was the whole point, right? To make people more sophisticated in their conceptions.
In which case, is it the case that it's over now? If people were to be educated out of those problems, and now that actually the higher education itself has become so ideologically driven that to go to university means you end up more indoctrinated than when you went there, what hope is there? I feel like I sound a bit frustrated here, but I feel like I'm bashing my head against a brick wall, because most of the time when I'm caught in an argument with these ideologues, they are arguing, like I say, with a monster they've created in their own heads. I'm not the person they think I am. I don't have the values they think I have. And therefore, the discussion is stymied from the outset. And it does make me very frustrated. And that's probably the real reason I wrote the book, actually, because I want the idea of free speech to be elevated again as a sacrosanct principle, so that we can have these conversations, and so that people don't get demonized and attacked for things they don't believe, and so that we can reach some kind of consensus on these issues that we've been describing, these contentious issues. Because when you have an issue that's particularly tendentious, it requires more conversation, it requires more discussion and more understanding, and I don't think we're getting that at the moment.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm somewhat optimistic about that, because I can see all the possibility that long-form conversations of this sort bring.
Well, there's an appetite for them,
Yes.
isn't there? But is there an appetite for them from the activists and the ideologues who see so much control in our major educational
Yes,
cultural
I think so.
institutions?
I think so. I
Well,
mean, I've been struck by how deep the hunger is for genuine conversation, and very much heartened by it. And so that's a counter movement.
I think you're right. I just don't see any evidence of that from the people I'm talking about. I don't see it from the people who will say to you,
it's
educate
another
yourself.
problem too, though, isn't it? With Twitter, for example, is that
Right.
it's never the same people, and that plays with us psychologically, because, of course, we are built to more or less assume that we're interacting with a continuous community,
Yeah.
And we aren't. We're interacting with a discontinuous community on Twitter, and so we're led astray in our presuppositions constantly. And
But
I
it's
mean,
worse than that. It's like because it isn't. I know it's different people all the time, but they all have the same views on absolutely everything. It feels like you're arguing with the Borg. It feels like just one mind speaking through many voices.
yes, well, it is. That's the hallmark of an ideology. It is precisely that.
And
Then I
that's
guess it's a
frustrating.
matter of it's a matter of trying to understand the ideology ever more deeply to see what it's actually focused on.
But I do read their books and I do read their articles and I do try to understand. I don't believe the people I'm talking about return the favour. They always use the phrase educate yourself. And what they mean by that is read these select books and digest them uncritically. That's what they mean by educate yourself. They don't mean read widely and tackle the various views and come to a conclusion yourself. The last thing they want is critical thought. Critical thought is the enemy. Ironically, it's the enemy of critical theory.
It's a hallmark of white supremacy culture, as far as I can see. Right.
That's what they say.
Well,
that's what they
become.
claim.
It's amazing too to see that set of ideas propagate itself across the culture so quickly. The Canadian federal government, in its diversity, inclusivity, and equity training program, now uses those concepts, like associating white supremacy with punctuality, for example. They use those in the training of their civil servants. It's been accepted wholeheartedly to that degree.
I've seen them. I've seen the screenshots that often get leaked of these training sessions, and bullet-pointed hallmarks of white supremacy: punctuality, politeness, hard
perfectionism.
Work. Yeah, all these noble things. And I'm thinking, well, if I was a person of colour, I would be outraged by this. This idea that this is a culture that's alien to me. It's so offensive, and this is.
It's so absurd, even. It's so absurd that you can hardly mount an argument against it. I mean, conscientiousness is a personality trait, and there's no racial differences in conscientiousness.
Right, and it wouldn't matter to me if it was just a few idiots on Twitter or these extreme. It wouldn't matter to me, but these people have disproportionate power, institutional power, political power. I mean, the Biden administration is on side with an awful lot of this kind of stuff, and the end point.
No, so is the Trudeau government. I mean, to have this in the training documentation that's produced by the federal government is just absolutely stunning. It's also the document that I was referring to. I tweeted about it yesterday. It's so badly written that it's stunning.
It's maddening with him. And how is it he's got away with his history of blackface, for instance? How is it that there is no consistency there?
Lack of effective opposition is a big part of it.
It's insane. I mean, if you look at those old videos, it looks like he spent more time in blackface than out of it. And yet he isn't the one who's being attacked and vilified for that. It's okay, he's got a free pass. It's weird to me.
Yeah, well, the opposition in Canada, and this is a problem in general, is a real problem for our entire culture, is that the woke narrative is very romantically attractive. It's got this rebelliousness about it and this impetus to go out and march in the streets and, to work on a global cause. And like traditional conservatives and even traditional liberals can't mount a counter narrative. They don't have the imagination. And it's a huge problem.
The trouble is, though, the cause that they're fighting for is largely illusory. And that to me is very frightening. We've had people in this country claim that our major universities, such as Oxford and Cambridge, are structurally, institutionally racist. All of the data tells us this is just simply not the case.
Oh, yes, well, that's just happening constantly in Canadian universities. The McGill Physics Department has now put out a diversity, inclusivity, and equity statement, and that's predicated on exactly those views.
Well, I think we need to push back against this particular hyper-racialization of society, because it is reinscribing old racial tropes, even to the extent of fear of miscegenation, this old racist idea of this fear of mixed couples. There was an article in The Guardian here recently talking about how finding mixed-race people attractive is problematic. This idea, it's almost just taking old racist ideas and just giving them a kind of hint of respectability. And of course, the end point of that is segregation. You saw presumably the story in California, the Brentwood school, the elite school that segregated its parents on their what was it, dialogue session with the teachers, and you would have white parents in one room.
And you're seeing that in convocation ceremonies at universities too.
How can this be anything other than racist? it's interesting that the group FAIR, the group Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, a lot of those people who are doing great work, I think, are starting to call this neo-racism. There needs to be a label for it, and I think maybe that's the right way to go about it, because the word racism has almost become meaningless because the people who use it the most, they throw it around so liberally, I never believe it when I hear someone branded that way. I assume it's someone not being honest, not being truthful. So what do we call this? What do you call it when people are advancing the cause of racial segregation in the name of anti-racism? What do you call that? I don't know what. I think that's going to be the real struggle. Is not just breaking through the fantasy world. I don't like this idea of having to negotiate someone else's dreamland. There's that thing, firstly, but also there's the linguistic minefields. How do you convince people? The other reason, I mean, you mentioned the rebellious aspect of it. I think the other reason why it's so appealing is because the language sounds like you're doing good. Social justice, anti-racism. Who wouldn't be anti-racist? Black Lives Matter. Of course they do. Who would disagree with that? But these phrasing can be used to push through some very pernicious ideas. And I mean, when it comes to anti-racism, for instance, I mean, Ibram X. Kendi makes it absolutely clear in his book that he feels to be not racist is simply another form of racism. That this dichotomy doesn't exist. Well, what? And that's why I find it very hard when I'm having these arguments, because if I say I have a real problem with anti-racism, people will say, oh, I see, so you're for racism. And then you have to explain what anti-racism means when used by these academics in these very niche fields such as whiteness studies. You have to explain first what that means, why that's dangerous for society, and how, in order to genuinely oppose racism, you have to oppose the discourse of anti-racism. I mean, when you say it like that, it's maddening, isn't it? It's like it's the stuff of nightmares because there is no coherent sense, and because so much of it is rooted in language and misdirection through language and shielding what is actually meant, it becomes impossible to win the argument, and maybe that's the point, maybe this, they gave the word to us, gaslighting, when they gaslight all the time and say the culture war is a right-wing myth, or cancel the people who are the chief practitioners of cancel culture, saying that cancel culture doesn't exist, when they say the opposite of what is the observable reality. I don't know how to break through that, how to break through those arguments, because not only have they constructed a pseudo-reality in their own minds, they've constructed the language with which to sustain that pseudo-reality so no one else can be drawn out of it. And that to me is going to be the challenge.
Let me ask you, let's go sideways for a minute now, and I suppose this is an exploration of potential solutions as well. This has been a very serious conversation, but you're a satirist and a comedian as well. And so
Isn't it terrible how unfunny I am in real life? Isn't that awful? When I'm doing stand-up, if I've got a script, I can be funny, but I can't be funny spontaneously. People are very disappointed about that. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm curious about your motivations.
Okay.
Let's talk about Titania McGrath. Why don't you describe her first for everyone?
So Titania McGrath originated as a Twitter character in around April 2018, and the idea of the character is that she is a very privileged, po-faced, young, white, intersectional activist who is determined to be offended by absolutely anything. She could problematize absolutely anything. You could give her, a pair of shoes or a hat or a holiday in Margate, and she would find a way to say that it is irredeemably transphobic and white supremacist or something like that. She can do those things that the activists always do, so nothing is ever good enough for her. She's also immensely privileged. She comes from, independently wealthy background. She lives in, one of those sort of gated communities, which is 99% white, but she has a deep mistrust of the working class, she thinks that she is virtuous and noble and good, and she goes on Twitter and goes on the attack all the time, trying to isolate things, trying to save the world in her through intersectional theory. And it's a very recognisable type of act. Even if you know nothing about intersectionality or anything of the stuff that came out of the school of thought of Kimberly Crenshaw or any of those academics, even if you know nothing about that, you will recognise this type of figure because this figure is ubiquitous on Twitter, on social media. They always have their pronouns in their bio. They always use the same terminology, such as hegemony or discourse or problematic or phallogocentric, if you want to go back to Derrida, and she knows the right jargon to use, lived experience, cultural appropriation, mansplaining, toxic masculinity, all of those kind of things. And we know, and all of these things tend to be slogans in substitute of thought. You know, they're just things that get thrown out there. And so what I wanted to do with the characters...
Do you know what slogan means?
What do you mean etymologically? No, I don't.
Sluet Garm. It means battle cry for the dead.
I love that.
Oh, God. If that doesn't send a chill up your back, you didn't understand it.
Well, this is it. I'm going to use that. That's great, because it is a kind of... it's almost like a battleground of zombies who don't have any capacity for independent thought anymore. I mean, you try and get into a conversation with someone like this.
Us included, though, man. You got it right. You're right, but it's us too.
And the slogans that come back at you all the time, and the lack of interrogation of those slogans, you know.
Well, what I find so frustrating and so horrifying in some sense, I mean, I think a great canonical example of that is the interview that Helen Lewis did with me for GQ. Which is, it's now more popular online than the Channel 4 interview, which I think the GQ interview has like 32 million views or something preposterous. But I never did talk to Helen Lewis. I just talked to the ideology, and it's not, I don't like that. I like to talk to the person and find out what they think. But
I heard you saying as well that before the interview, she was very frosty and
yes.
Almost as though she had decided what you were in advance, funnily.
Oh, there was no almost. She had definitely decided what I was before the discussion.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
And she's been beating the same drum more recently as well, which has driven many people to the interview, because she published an article in the Atlantic Monthly and in another locale as well.
So when you're faced with those, I mean, I just see it all the time so often. And to give another recent example, that we had the obviously since the Harry and Meghan interview with Oprah Winfrey, and there was a controversy over here because Piers Morgan, who hosts a show called Good Morning Britain, got into an argument with another colleague on the show, a man called Alex Beresford, I think. And it was really interesting watching. Once they'd had the argument, they sat down, they tried to talk through the issues. And Piers Morgan pointed out that some of the things that Meghan had said in the interview were factually wrong and had been proven to be factually wrong. His response was, Alex Beresford's response was, but that's her lived experience. And then he said, yes, but we have the evidence here that it is factually incorrect. And again he said, but it's her lived experience. So in other words...
See, that's that insistence that the fantasy world, the subjective world, trumps everything.
Right. And that once you've... It's almost like these phrases... If you use the phrase lived experience or toxic masculinity, whatever, you're in the club. What you've signalled that you're right. You know, and I know that academics have always done this. You know, the jargon. You're in the group. You're in the in-group if you've got the right. If you know how to deploy the right words. But there's something more sinister about this because
you're morally right in these situations. That's the sinister thing.
That's it. It's morally incontrovertible. You've made the statement, and that's it. And there's no further discussion.
Yes, well, you're not evil. That's what you're saying.
Right.
I'm not evil.
So I think so the reason with Titania, I wanted her to be obsessed with this language, and why I read so much of this stuff, so that I knew the way that they speak, is because I thought the best way to expose the inherent contradictions of that position and the thoughtlessness. Moreover, the thoughtlessness of that position is to embody it in a character.
Right, so you were playing a dramatic game, essentially, which is a form of thought.
In doing so, I've actually come to understand the people I'm satirising a whole lot more. And look, let's face it, every now and then they'll hit on a point that is actually right. And you know, even when I read White Fragility by Robert DiAngelo, which I think is a terrible book and is so flawed throughout, every now and then she'll hit on something and you think for a moment, oh, there's something in that. And then she'll undercut it by saying, well, everyone's a racist, no one's racist. You know, and it just goes back to being absurd. But, and that book in of itself is a very good example of this, you know, setting up a reality that cannot be penetrated, because she will say that any kind of critical questioning of her position is evidence of the very pervasiveness of white supremacy that she's identified. So you can't win, because even engaging in a discussion is proof of your malevolence, according to her theory. It's absolutely hopeless. But I thought because the movement is so riven with contradiction, actually the more effective way of tackling it isn't through dialogue. Firstly, because the people I'm talking about are impervious to reason. They mistrust dialogue. They see debate as a form of violence. So you're never going to get through to them that way.
Yeah, and that's actually an explicit part of the theory.
It really is. So then, in creating a satirical character,
Right, it's not that they're anti-free speech. There's no such thing as free speech in that theoretical framework.
No,
It's a misapprehension all the way down to the bottom.
Which is why I get so frustrated. I've often been in debates where I've tried to invite these very people to participate in the debate, to hear them out, and they would say that to even appear would be to dignify the position. So it's an absolute nightmare. And it also protects themselves from potential criticism, which is of course the whole point. But I thought by creating a satirical character that embodies those contradictions, that thoughtlessness, it might reflect back onto them I suppose how they look to normal people, because I don't think they appreciate. I think they're so caught up within their own little bubbles, within their own little groups. They never hear an alternative point of view. I mean, I used to work with academics like this who were so within their little groups, and they're constantly quoting each other and supporting each other and giving the illusion that their views cannot be disputed. But what if you're suddenly confronted with how other people perceive you? And will that give you pause for thought?
Okay, so when you started Titania, you didn't announce that she was a satirical character. You started playing on Twitter. Tell me the story. What happened? Because that Twitter account became extraordinarily well known and very rapidly. So I'm curious about how you did that and how you responded once it started to, amass some cultural significance.
I was very surprised that it took on. It became so popular so quickly, and I'd started it because more to entertain myself more than anything. I was so frustrated with this, and I wanted to try and expose the absurdity of it. I mean, my background is as a stand-up comic, and as a stand-up comic, I'm not necessarily satirical. I will stand there on the stage and ridicule the thing that I perceive to be a problem with society. With satire, what you're doing is you're often embodying it with a kind of ironic detachment, or you are, you're addressing it. You're always going after what you perceive to be the vices and follies of society, and I thought that was a good way of doing it.
Right, so you had to stay on a kind of edge. You had to be believable enough as the character,
right,
so that you could pass, but you had to push it just past the point of what? Of rationality or believability?
Yeah,
it's a funny edge.
I was continually getting into arguments with people, staying in character. I've always stayed in character, and even to today. And I've actually, if you go to the Titania account now, my pinned thread is a thread of conversations that I've had with people in character who are angry about the things I've tweeted. And these can go on for pages and pages, and it's fascinating to me because it's close enough to the truth. She says really ridiculous things, really absurd things, like speaking or writing in English is an act of colonial violence. She'll say that, the only way to guard against fascism is if the state are allowed to arrest people for what they say and think. Stuff like this, which is so obviously absurd, and yet it's close enough to what people actually say that people believe it and get annoyed about it. And what I've always liked to do is to stay in character and have those conversations with these people, and then I posted the screenshots of the conversation. So, but part of the point of that is not to humiliate the people who had fallen for it, because actually the point I'm making is I understand why they would fall for it, because it's so close to what people actually say, and by doing that, my hope is, I suppose, that it exposes the folly of this stuff. Sometimes even when I'm in those arguments, I will say something that is so out of just completely out of the realm of possibility, so stupid, and yet they still don't. Things have become so absurd that they don't twig. I mean, even today, there was a story today in the UK, a museum, a Jane Austen museum, is now going to interrogate Jane Austen's use of sugar in her tea because it has connections to plantations and white supremacy and slavery. Something like that, which is just so absurd. Or the recent controversy over Bluey, the Australian cartoon dog, because it doesn't have enough dogs of colour and gender diverse dogs in the cartoon. Now that sounds like something I would make up as a joke, but it's real. It's actually
True.
People are taking it seriously, and so therefore, in a sense, it's become harder with Titania.
Oh boy.
Because anything that I come up with is going to be topped by real life. Very, very quickly.
True.
But what have you learned about the people that Titania annoys? So she's a hyper-politically correct avatar, but she tangles up people who are opposed to that sort of thing. And so that must have also shed substantial light for you on people on the other side of the.
It does.
And so, what have you learned?
Well, one of the things is that the people on the other side, who might even be who might even be of my opinion about these things, a lot of people are very quick to anger, and verbal abuse as an instant response. So a lot of the people who get angry with her really go after her looks, and I mean, she's not real. A friend of mine, Lisa, created the image of the woman. She's a composite of 4 different women, so it's not a parody. See, this is the thing. It's not a parody of any particular person. It's a type of person. And yeah, the people who get angry with her, and the people who are genuinely angry about the social justice movement, are absolutely furious about the way it is impinging on every aspect of their lives. They are sick of it. So when they see someone as extreme as Titania, they really let rip. And I don't think that's healthy. You know, it's not in my nature to go and abuse someone online or to get angry online. But I've seen the extent that what it shows, I suppose, is that kind of instinct to immediately go for the abusive or the vicious or the attack or the ad hominem is present across the political spectrum. It's everywhere. Or maybe that's just a sign of Twitter. Maybe that's just a symptom of social media. And I've learned a lot about how social media works. I think that's another thing about it, is that I've really, for one thing, the fact that she's been banned a number of times, and I've learned how to avoid the bans, and about the way that big tech censors and how they censor and why.
And what is she being banned for?
So the tweets that she was banned for, a couple of times she's had a number of 1-day suspensions, a number of 7-day suspensions. Once or twice it's been inexplicable to me why she would be banned. It seems a bit like someone at Silicon Valley has twigged that their precious ideology is being mocked and they don't like it. That's the only explanation I can think of. However, on a couple of instances, it's when she's I suppose what they would say incited violence. And of course she hasn't done anything of the kind. There was one tweet where she said she was going to go to a UKIP rally. UKIP is a right-wing nationalist political party in the UK. And she said, I'm going to go to this UKIP rally to punch people in the name of compassion or love or something like that, you know, which is the idea that a lot of these activists have, that actually, whereas words are violence and awful, actual physical violence can be defended, you know, in their view. It's so perverse. And of course I was making a comment about the perversity of that idea, that you think microaggressions are actual violence, but you're perfectly content to go out and set fire to cars and beat people up if they have the wrong opinion, or pepper spray people in the face if they voted for Trump. You know, there's an obvious contradiction there that I was trying to expose. So she had a ban there. I think that might have even been the one where she was permanently banned. I had an email from Twitter saying, this is a permanent ban, you're not getting back on. And then there was a bit of an outcry from people who follow her, some prominent people who follow her, and Twitter changed their minds and brought her back. And as a result of that, inevitably, her follower count leapt, because of course when you try and censor something, you draw attention to it. But you're always treading a fine line. I mean, my friend Lisa, who I mentioned, Lisa Graves, used to have a Twitter account called Jarvis Dupont, who is one of my favourite accounts on Twitter, and he was banned, completely permanently banned. They actually went on a bit of a purge of satire accounts. There was one afternoon where Twitter purged 12 or 13 satirical accounts and deleted them. Titania came back for some reason. I think it's because she was the bigger account. But a lot of them just got ditched, and that, I think, shows that, you know, the powers that be at Silicon Valley, they don't like to be mocked. No one in authority likes to be mocked. It's the best way to undermine authority, isn't it? And it's why every despot in history has killed the clown.
Well, you know, that's why we have to be so careful when any of our laws start making comedians nervous. They're the ultimate canary in the coal mine. And even more so than artists, I think. The artists are next, probably, but...
Absolutely. I mean, you'll know in Canada, Mike Ward was fined, I think, $42,000 by the Quebec Human Rights Commission for a joke that he told. And by the way, you know, this
yes,
is
and Montreal, of course, has one of the world's great comedy festivals, and some of that humor, I've been to the comedy festival a couple of times, and at midnight you can go and hear particularly outrageous comedy, which I actually think it was one of those where he said what he got fined for.
And I don't even know the context because he said it in French, for one thing, so I didn't fully understand. But I read the transcript and I spoke to him about it, and what was interesting is that he's not some, you know, open mic act who hasn't been on the set. He's an established, famous, successful comedian who was fined for a joke that, if you actually break it down and analyse it, there's nothing remotely offensive about it. You know, I mean, it's perfectly possible. I don't think comedy can exist without the potential to cause offence. Now,
Yeah,
what worries
no.
me,
Neither can truth.
right, quite. And so
Comedy
what
is
worries-
almost always truth. Almost always. A comedian says something funny and it's true in a way that people didn't expect and they know it. And
But it's also that thing of teasing the boundaries of tolerance, of almost having that kind of cathartic effect, the way that the ancient Greeks would watch a tragedy and hear about the dismemberment and all sorts of vile things to philosophically to purge themselves of that evil that lay within. In a sense, when you hear a comedian say something utterly outrageous, it can have that effect on you, and you laugh in spite of yourself, and then you laugh again because you are saying to yourself, "Why did I laugh at that? That makes me. I shouldn't have done that." So you're almost laughing at your own response as well. It has a double effect, and we are really losing that. I mean, I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the UK, a lot of this kind of mistrust of comedy and mistrust of jokes, and the idea that certain jokes normalise hatred, is coming from the comedians themselves, and a lot of comedians take it on themselves to police other comedians' material, and they get very angry when people broach certain subjects. I consider it very, very unhealthy. And not all comedians, by the way, I'm not saying that all comedians, I'm just saying certainly the more establishment comedians absolutely would fall into this category. And it's really shocked me. This has been, since I started Titania in particular, a lot of comedians have been very angry that I mocked the social justice movement, or you know, that I, you know, which to me is absurd because, you know, I spent 3 years co-writing the Jonathan Pye character, and because that predominantly mocked Trump and the right and conservatives, and you know, those were the targets. That was okay. So I never got this kind of venom about that. But as soon as I was mocking social justice ideology, which I perceive to be an extremely powerful ideology, you know, this isn't. I don't think I'm punching down. I think I'm punching up at these people who have captured these institutions and are ruthless, by the way, absolutely ruthless, and bullying. I think the social justice movement utterly legitimises bullying, and I don't like bullies, and I like to stand up to bullies, and that, Titania, is my attempt to stand up against the bullies. But what they will do is misrepresent my intentions, and will say, "Oh no, you just want to have a go at gay people or whatever, or have a go at minority groups," and I've been very shocked by that, because that kind of response has even come from comedians. And my view is that if you've got half a brain, you know that's not what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. You absolutely have to know that that's not what I'm doing, and yet maybe they do know. Maybe
They
this
do.
is a willful
They do know.
misinterpretation as a means to attack me because I've mocked the ideology I'm not meant to mock. But I tell you what, whenever there are consequences for mocking someone, then I think that's the person you ought to be mocking, right? I think that's a sign.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, would you, what effect has producing Titania had on your life? And if you could go back and decide whether you were going to do it again, would you? I mean, it must be shocking.
Yeah.
I would think it's shocking to have seen what happened, to be at the center of what happened when you created that character. But I'd like to know.
Well, for one thing, I didn't expect the reaction that I got. Also, you've got to remember that for a long time the character, I was anonymous, because I part of the effect of the character was that people thought she was real. That was so sort of integral to it. And then I was outed by a newspaper over here the week that her first book came out. And although that was very good for the books, it generated a lot of publicity, because then the story became that I was the person behind the character. In effect, it had an enervating impact on the character, because now what happens, people know it's me behind the character. However, what I will say is, even to this day, there's always some people who fall for it. Whenever I tweet something, there's always some people who fall for it. So it has that. So there's that. But then there's the impact on my personal life. Well, I would do it again, because I feel very passionately that the movement that I'm mocking, the ideology that I'm mocking, is a dangerous one. And I feel very passionately that it is divisive and damaging to society, as damaging as any ideology can be. I think it has the potential to go to those lengths. And so that I think I would almost be in dereliction if I didn't mock it. It would be. I tell you what it would be. It would be an act of self-censorship if I didn't go after these targets. And that's, by the way, how most comedians. I mean, a lot of comedians think this stuff is ridiculous. They won't go near it because they know that if they do, they won't get on the BBC and they won't get booked by certain clubs. So they just leave it well alone. But I think I couldn't do. I just, that's not in my nature. So I don't regret that. The fact that so many friends of mine, former friends on the comedy circuit, no longer talk to me. That's something which I suppose I could say is unfortunate. On the other hand,
How many times has that happened to you? How many friends do you think you've lost?
Oh, thousands.
it's in double figures.
Yeah.
It's certainly in double figures, and I think, and it's not just Tanya. It's also partly, I suppose, my politics. It's also, it, it's effectively being honest about what I think, and saying opinions that might not be the establishment or fashionable opinions, and it gets people very angry. I mean, one particular incident I can think of was when I met for a drink with two friends, very old friends of mine, a married couple. And he started screaming at me in the pub. I won't swear on your podcast, but calling me an effing Nazi, and then another word which I probably shouldn't say at this point. But I thought he was joking at first, and we had this conversation, and it was true. He'd completely bought into this fantasy of who I was, and there was no going back from that. And I know it was fueled by alcohol, but no apology was forthcoming, or no. It's. And then every now and then there'll be, it happened to me a couple of months ago where a comedian I've known for many, many years from the circuit suddenly sent me this abusive message online on Twitter and started attacking me and saying he said I was funded by dark foreign powers or something utterly absurd, and I thought, well, okay, so this is now...
Of course, that is what you'd say if you were funded by dark foreign powers.
Well, this is the problem. Like I said, I've said it before. Like if I am getting all this dark money, it must be very dark because I haven't seen any of it. It's not. That'd be great, fine, but I'm not. And this idea that I'm this sort of, it's that going right back to what you said at the start, that I'm defending free speech because because I'm an evil person who wants to say evil things, and so there's all of that. All that I'm mocking minority groups through Tanya, which is absolutely not what I'm doing. It's the opposite. I'm mocking those very affluent and powerful people who very patronisingly assume that they know what's best for minorities. It's the opposite of what people say it is. But these kind of experiences, on the one hand, I think it's a bit sad, isn't it? Because there are people now, I've had to go through my phone and delete lots of numbers because I know we'll never talk again. But on the other hand, were they my friends to begin with? I'm not so sure. If they can suddenly become so bigoted, and that is the word.
It's an indication of how profound the divide has started to become in our culture, right? 20 years ago, I never lost any friends because of my hypothetical political opinions, but things have changed.
You must have lost. Your case must be much more severe than mine. Because you're so much more famous and so much more known. Have lots of friends turned on you?
No. Actually, not a lot. There's some outstanding exceptions. Although even in those situations, I would say there was extenuating circumstances. No, I've been really fortunate in that regard that my close circle of intimates, my family and my close friends have been staggeringly loyal to me under
which is wonderful.
Severe distress. Yes,
that's wonderful. And so, is it maybe the case? Does that tell us that actually? What it's really about is the fact that I was working in an industry, which is, the comedy industry is so on board with the woke ideology to such an extent that in fact, so many comedians are now really just avatars for that ideology. Maybe.
My professional colleagues certainly haven't leapt to my defense.
Well, that's what I was going to ask actually.
Yes.
Surely.
That's pretty much done with. I would say my name, I've decided this recently, because of the slurs that have been associated with me, I can't in good conscience accept graduate students anymore. Because if they go out, you talked at the beginning about this register that's been set up in Britain, where if you are accused of a non-crime hate act, it's recorded without a trial. I've been on hiring committees many, many times, and especially in academia, there's an oversupply of highly qualified people, of radical oversupply. And so if there's anything in your record at all that's the least bit contentious, it's like you're done. And so being my student, that's not a little bit contentious, that's really, really contentious. And so it's now become impossible for me to serve my proper
Right.
function as a scientist and as a university professor. So it's taking a lot of adjustment on my part to get accustomed to that. And I don't practice clinically anymore as well, and there are a variety of reasons for that. But certainly, I've become very, very susceptible to attacks through the College of Psychologists, the governing board. They can make the life of a practitioner brutally miserable with a single letter, and that's very, very punishing. And it's also perhaps not necessarily good for my potential clients to be associated with someone who's controversial. They already have enough trouble. So, although I've been fortunate on the family and friends front, on the professional front, things have been, more dismal.
Isn't that just suggestive of the power of this movement and the effectiveness of cancel culture? In fact, the ease with which people can become stigmatized. All it takes is a few accusations of you're far right or alt right or whatever, and it's there. Any prospective employer can Google that and it comes up, and who's going to take the risk? The accusation is sufficient to damn you, and that's what.
Well, that you put the finger on the absolute catastrophe of the non-crime hate index. It's like, well, it's a permanent stain, especially in a technological universe where nothing is ever forgotten, no matter how long the lag.
And it's worse because the government here feels no compunction to address this or to.
It's
no
staggering
politicians
to me.
seem to have. Well, I suppose they are. Well, because the strategy is that if you oppose hate speech laws, you're obviously a hateful person. Why else would you oppose hate speech laws? It's the old thing, and a politician doesn't want to stand up in Parliament to be the one who is seen to be siding with the evil guys, the bad guys.
So you have to make a very, very subtle argument to stand up against hate speech laws, because you're faced with the problem that there is such a thing as hate speech.
Yeah,
Obviously. And it's pernicious and terrible. It's like, okay, so you're arguing uphill. This is again why it's such a bloody miracle that we ever had free speech to begin with. It's almost inconceivable to me that we managed to generate the baseline presumption of innocence. That's a miracle. The fact that you can go bankrupt and start again, that's a miracle. The idea